"Who is controlling your breath right now?" the man said, his voice calm enough to feel like a threat instead of a question. The bracelet on her wrist blinked once, soft red light under the metal band, like it had hurt him too. She froze, fingers still wrapped around a cracked wine glass, and the faint sound of a hidden tracker clicking beneath her skin filled the silence between them. No one else in the room reacted, but the mafia boss did not look away. He stared at her wrist like it had just confessed a crime. 3 hours earlier, the same bracelet had been locked onto her arm in a room that smelled like polished marble and legal ink. She stood in the center of a private penthouse selection chamber, wearing a pale dress chosen for her, not by her, while 12 men reviewed her like a contract clause. "She is compliant," the handler said smoothly, sliding a document across the table without ever calling her name. She wasn't a person here. She was an arrangement, a role, a fake wife sent to complete a political agreement between families too powerful to fail. Her hand stayed still at her side, even though the bracelet on her wrist tightened every time her pulse rose too fast. It was not jewelry. It was calibration. She learned that word without ever being taught it. When she shifted her weight, it tightened. When she hesitated, it warmed like warning skin. "Turn her slightly," one of the men said, not looking at her face. She obeyed before she was even asked again. Silence was safer than correction. The mafia boss arrived late. No announcement, no escort, just the sound of doors opening like the room had decided to stop breathing. When he stepped in, the air changed, not louder, colder. He didn't greet anyone. He looked at the contract first, then at her wrist. Not her face, her wrist. That was the first time she felt seen and dissected at the same time. "That device," he said quietly, "is live." The handler smiled like it was a misunderstanding. "It's a compliance accessory. For stability." She kept her eyes down, but her fingers twitched once. Barely noticeable. The bracelet responded instantly with a faint pulse under her skin, like it was listening. The mafia boss noticed that too. His gaze sharpened, and for the first time, he looked at her like she was not part of the system, but inside it. "Does it hurt when you move?" he asked her directly. The room shifted. That was not in protocol. She hesitated, then nodded once. "Barely. A mistake." The handler stepped in quickly, voice smooth, almost kind. "She's just nervous. This is her first adjustment phase." Adjustment. Not life. Not marriage. Adjustment. The mafia boss moved closer without breaking eye contact with her wrist. Not rushing. Not aggressive. Controlled. Like pressure building behind glass. "Show me," he said. She didn't understand at first. Then he reached out, not for her hand but for the bracelet. And the moment his fingers touched the metal, it blinked red again, harder this time, like it recognized interference. And somewhere beneath it, something inside her skin reacted with a silent, painful pulse that made her breath catch without sound. The bracelet stopped blinking the moment his fingers touched it, but the silence that followed felt worse. Like the system inside it was listening harder than before. "Remove your hand," the handler said softly, almost politely, as if he were correcting table manners rather than interrupting something alive. The mafia boss didn't move away. He tilted the bracelet slightly, and a faint second pulse answered from inside her wrist. Too synchronized to be random, too precise to be human. She inhaled sharply, and the sound of it betrayed her more than her words ever could. "That's not possible," one of the men behind the handler muttered, but no one looked at him. All eyes stayed on her wrist, like it had suddenly become evidence in a crime no one had admitted existed yet. 3 hours later, the same air of control still clung to her skin, except now she was in the lower service corridor of the penthouse, where the carpet was thinner and the silence had a different texture. Less ceremony, more concealment. She stood near a stainless steel counter, pretending to adjust a tray of untouched champagne glasses, while the staff moved around her like she was part of the furniture. A dishwasher roared somewhere behind her, steam pressing against the vents, and the smell of citrus cleaner mixed with old coffee grounds. Normal things. Too normal. That was what made it wrong. Her wrist ached beneath the bracelet, a dull pressure that came and went like a signal searching for alignment. She kept her hand steady anyway, even when it wanted to tremble. On the counter beside her lay a folded service log. She didn't mean to look at it at first, but her eyes caught a line that didn't belong. Table assignments, timestamps, signatures. One entry was missing. Not erased. Never recorded. Table 12 never existed, she said quietly without turning around. The bartender paused mid-wipe. What? She pointed once, precise. That table was served wine at 8:42. But it's not in the log. The bartender hesitated too long before answering. You're new. Sometimes logs get adjusted after review. Adjusted, not corrected. The bracelet on her wrist gave a faint heat response again, as if reacting to the word. From the doorway, the mafia boss appeared without announcement.
No entourage.
No sound, just presence filling space like pressure dropping before a storm. His eyes moved from the log to her wrist to her face. He didn't ask what she was doing. He asked something smaller. What time did you arrive here tonight? She blinked. 6:15. A pause. She continued anyway because the truth was simpler than permission. But the entry scan says 6:40. That wasn't speculation. That was the old phone in her pocket. Her own, returned briefly for logistics, still showing the entry notification she had seen herself. The mafia boss didn't react outwardly, but his gaze sharpened by a fraction, like a lock finding the wrong keyhole. The handler appeared again. Smile perfect, voice softer than necessary. System delays. Happens during events like this. She didn't look at him. Instead, she pulled the old phone from her pocket and turned the screen slightly toward the light. Then why is there a deleted voice log at 6:32 saying I was already inside? The corridor went still in a way that wasn't physical. It was administrative, like something had been interrupted in the structure of the room itself. The bartender stepped back. The dishwasher noise suddenly felt too loud. The handler's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes recalculated. You must be mistaken, he said gently, like correcting a child. But she shook her head once. Not emotional. Not defensive. Certain. I don't forget voices. The mafia boss looked at the phone now, not her, not the handler. He extended a hand slightly, not to take it, but to signal. One of his men stepped forward instantly, took a photo of the screen, then another of her wrist without asking.
No chaos. No confrontation.
Just collection. Documentation. Evidence forming in silence. The handler smiled again, but it was thinner now. We can resolve any confusion privately. She finally looked up at him. Then explain why my bracelet logs my heartbeat, but not my arrival time. No answer came fast enough. That was the first real silence that felt like fear. The mafia boss turned slightly toward her, voice low enough that only she could hear it. Did anyone else touch your phone before tonight? She hesitated, then nodded once. Security took it for verification. Before I came in. A second pause. Longer. He didn't look surprised. He looked like something had just aligned. From her pocket, the phone screen flickered once. Just a notification, then nothing. But in that half second, she saw it. A second entry log timestamped 6:15. Overwritten but not erased. Labeled under a name that wasn't hers. The handler stepped forward again. Too smooth. Too prepared. You're overthinking a scheduling discrepancy. She looked down at the bracelet as it pulsed once more, deeper this time, like it had heard the name too. And then she said it softly, almost to herself, not realizing the room had already gone quiet enough to hear everything. Then why does my bracelet think I was never supposed to arrive at all? The moment she finished speaking, the air didn't change. But the room did. Not louder, not quieter. Just tighter, like something invisible had been pulled one notch too far and refused to snap back. The handler let out a soft, controlled laugh, the kind that was carefully trained not to sound like panic. That's a serious misunderstanding of how encrypted systems work, he said gently, as if explaining weather patterns to someone inexperienced. But his hand moved just once, toward his inner pocket before stopping himself. The mafia boss noticed that movement more than the words. He always did. She stood very still, feeling the bracelet pulse once against her skin like a second heartbeat that didn't belong to her. Then she did something small, almost invisible. She turned slightly toward the stainless steel counter behind her, where the service log still lay open. Her fingers didn't shake as she flipped one page back. The ink there was neat, precise, too neat for a busy night. But one line broke the pattern. Table 12. 8:42 p.m. Service completed. Signature. No name. No initial. Just a blank line where identity should have been. That entry, she said quietly, not looking at anyone, doesn't match the timestamp on my phone. The bartender froze again. Not dramatic. Not obvious. Just long enough to be noticed. Logs get standardized, he said too quickly this time. It's normal. She lifted her eyes. Normal doesn't delete signatures. Silence followed, not the dramatic kind, but the administrative kind, the kind that happens when systems realize they are being observed. The mafia boss moved closer to the counter, his gaze dropping to the log, then to the bracelet again. Where is table 12 located? He asked. The bartender hesitated. It's not assigned. It's a rotational overflow slot. That answer landed wrong. Even she knew it. She had served long enough in smaller places to know that overflow tables still had numbers, still had bodies, still had witnesses. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out something folded too tightly to be accidental. A printed receipt, edges softened like it had been handled too many times. She didn't know why she kept it. Habit. Instinct. Fear. I served wine there, she said. At 8:42.
Château Lorne.
2 glasses. 1 signature charge. She unfolded it fully and placed it on the counter. The handler's smile returned instantly, but thinner now. Anyone can misread a receipt under pressure. She didn't respond to him. Instead, she tapped the bottom corner of the paper. Then explain why this copy is printed at 9:03. But the original terminal log shows no transaction until 9:11. That was the first real fracture. Not loud, not explosive, just a mismatch in time that shouldn't exist. The mafia boss picked up the receipt without touching her, studying it like it might move on its own. His thumb traced the ink line where the timestamp sat, then stopped. This was reprinted, he said softly. Not a question, a conclusion. The handler exhaled through his nose, almost amused again. System recalibration happens during high-volume events. But she saw it now. The way his smile didn't reach his eyes anymore. The way his posture had shifted half an inch backward without permission. The way his phone screen, briefly visible when he adjusted his cuff, showed a notification he immediately dismissed. She remembered something then. Small, sharp, the security scanner at the entrance. The guard who had looked at her bracelet longer than her face. The hesitation before the green light turned red. Then green again. I wasn't scanned at 6:15, she said suddenly. The bartender looked up too fast. That's impossible. She turned her wrist slightly, letting the bracelet catch the overhead light. Then why does the entry system show a second scan at 6:40? Under a different ID? The mafia boss's gaze lifted from the receipt to her face for the first time in a full, uninterrupted line. Not sympathy, not belief, measurement. And for the first time, he asked her nothing at all. Instead, he said quietly to one of his men, "Pull the camera feed from the west corridor. 6:10 to 6:50. The handler's smile finally broke. Not fully, just enough to show the seam beneath it. That corridor camera was under maintenance, he said immediately. She didn't react, but the mafia boss did. He looked at the handler for a long moment, then at her wrist again. And this time his voice dropped lower than before. Then someone already knew we would ask for it. The first thing that changed was not the room, it was the people inside it. The handler straightened his cufflinks like nothing had happened, but his eyes no longer stayed still. The mafia boss had not spoken for several seconds, yet the silence around him felt structured now, deliberate, like it had been arranged instead of created. Bring the corridor feed anyway, he said finally, voice low enough that it didn't belong to the conversation anymore. It belonged to control. A server appeared near the glass doors of the private dining suite, holding a tablet with practiced urgency. "There's a minor delay," the server said politely. "IT is verifying access permissions due to system overlap." She stood slightly behind the marble counter, hands folded around the edge of a folded service cloth, her bracelet faintly warm against her skin. She didn't move because moving wrong here meant becoming noise. The handler turned slightly toward her, smile returning with careful precision. "You're doing very well," he said softly, like praising someone for staying calm during turbulence. "Just stay where you are." It was not a suggestion. It was placement. The mafia boss stepped closer to the server instead of her, which made the room subtly shift. Attention redirected, pressure redistributed. "System overlap doesn't erase footage," he said. "Not louder, just final." The server hesitated. That hesitation lasted too long to be innocent. "We are retrieving backup," he replied. From the side entrance, a woman entered, elegant, composed, wearing a thin black blazer over a gold necklace that marked her as executive staff. Her eyes went directly to the woman in the center of the room and softened just enough to be performative. "There seems to be some confusion," she said gently. "We should not escalate this during a live arrangement." The word arrangement landed heavier than anything else in the room. The waitress didn't respond immediately. She adjusted her grip on the folded cloth in her hands instead, as if anchoring herself to something real. Then she spoke carefully without raising her voice. "I didn't request escalation." The executive smiled, the kind of smile used in boardrooms before decisions are made without consent. "Of course not. But inconsistencies happen when multiple systems are syncing. It doesn't mean something is wrong." The mafia boss looked at her. When she said that, not the executive, not the handler, her. "Do you recognize the woman in the footage at 6:40? He asked suddenly. The server blinked. "We haven't confirmed the feed yet." "Answer," he said quietly. The room tightened again. The waitress watched the exchange, then did something small but precise. She placed the printed receipt from earlier onto the marble counter between them. Not aggressively, not dramatically, just placement. "That receipt shows a transaction at table 12, she said, "at 8:42. But the system says I wasn't scanned in until 6:40 under a different ID." The executive glanced at the receipt and then away almost immediately. "You are not trained to interpret system logs," she said. Still polite, still controlled. "You are here for service support." The word support made her still for half a second. Not because it hurt, but because it reduced her into something unmeasurable. She nodded once, slowly, as if accepting a rule she intended to test instead of obey. "Then I won't interpret it," she said. "I'll just ask why my name is missing from every record between 6:15 and 6:50. The handler stepped forward slightly. "You're becoming confused under pressure." "No," she replied instantly, calm.
Exact. I'm remembering correctly.
That sentence changed something in the room. Not loudly, quietly, like a lock refusing a key it had accepted before. The mafia boss turned his head slightly toward the executive staff now. "Show me the raw feed," he said. "Not backup. Not summary. Raw." The executive's smile held, but the edges began to thin. "That requires higher authorization." "Then get it," he replied. A pause. Then the server's tablet buzzed. Once. Then again. A notification flashed briefly before being dismissed too quickly for comfort. The waitress noticed it. So did he. The mafia boss. He didn't point it out. He simply stepped closer to the tablet and said, very softly, "You just tried to clear a notification." No one answered. But the executive's hand moved behind her back, just slightly, toward her phone. A gesture too practiced to be accidental. The handler spoke again, gently now, almost sympathetic. "This is becoming disruptive for her. Perhaps we should continue this privately." The mafia boss cut him off without raising his voice. "She stays." The silence after that was not empty. It was ownership of attention. And for the first time, the executive looked directly at the waitress again. not as an error but as a problem that had started producing witnesses. "You're making assumptions based on incomplete data," she said carefully. The waitress tightened her grip on the cloth once, then spoke quietly, almost apologetic, but steady. "Then show me the complete data." The server's tablet screen flickered, just for a second, long enough for everyone to see a file name before it disappeared again. The mafia boss saw it too. He didn't react outwardly, but his eyes narrowed slightly, like something that was supposed to be sealed had just failed its seal. And the executive, who had been composed since she entered, finally stopped smiling altogether. The moment the file name flashed on the tablet again, just for a fraction of a second before vanishing, the room didn't move, but attention did. Like every person inside had instinctively leaned closer without physically doing it. The executive recovered first, her voice smoothing back into corporate control. "Temporary caching error," she said. "Nothing more than a synchronization lag between secure nodes." But her fingers didn't leave her phone this time. They stayed pressed against it, too still. The mafia boss didn't look at her. He was already walking toward the server's tablet. Not fast, not aggressive, just inevitable. The waitress remained where she was, but her hand slid into the inner pocket of her service apron. When she pulled it out, it wasn't empty. An old phone, scratched at the corners, screen slightly dimmed from age, rested in her palm like it had been hidden there longer than tonight. "This was logged under my replacement profile," she said quietly, not accusing, just stating what she had already verified twice in her own mind. The handler turned slightly, smile still intact, but the patience behind it had thinned. "That device is not relevant to tonight's arrangement. It has one saved number," she replied. Her thumb hovered over the screen without pressing it yet. "The entry log for table 12. That sentence didn't land immediately. It took half a second too long to be dismissed. The mafia boss stopped walking. Not fully turning, just stopping. That was worse than a reaction. It meant something had aligned in his mind that no one else could see yet. The executive exhaled a small laugh, controlled and soft. "She is referencing a personal device. It has no verified integration into our system." But the waitress didn't look at her. She turned the phone slightly toward the mafia boss instead. "It shows me arriving at 6:15, she said. "Not 6:40. The screen flickered faintly, weak battery struggling against exposure. One entry glowed. "Inbound scanned. 6:15 p.m. Guest ID. Unknown override." The handler stepped forward immediately. "That device has not been authorized for security logging. Anyone could spoof timestamps." The mafia boss finally looked at him, just once. "Then explain why your system issued it a guest override instead of a rejection." Silence tightened instantly. Not dramatic, precise. The executive's expression didn't break, but her eyes shifted, just slightly, toward the waitress's wrist again, as if recalculating risk instead of presence. The waitress spoke again, quieter this time but sharper. "It wasn't spoofed. It was paired." She turned the phone over. On the back, beneath the worn case, a faint etched code sat barely visible, matching the bracelet pattern on her wrist. The mafia boss saw it. He didn't reach for it yet. He just stared. A long pause stretched through the room, heavier than sound. Then he asked, very slowly, "Who paired it?" No one answered immediately. The handler did. Too quickly. System integration requires pre-authorization from compliance oversight. She would not have access. "That's not what I asked." The mafia boss cut in, still calm. The waitress didn't speak this time. She didn't need to. Her silence was structured, intentional, protective of something she didn't yet fully understand but refused to surrender. The executive finally stepped closer, her tone softening into something almost sympathetic. "You are misinterpreting a logistical onboarding device as personal evidence. That phone was issued for transitional tracking purposes only." "Transitional," the waitress repeated once, not questioning, remembering, and then she looked down at the phone again, pressing one icon she hadn't noticed before. A voicemail opened automatically. Not played, just queued. The mafia boss saw the timestamp before it could be dismissed. 6:32 p.m. Exactly the missing gap everyone had been circling. The handler moved too late to stop her thumb. The voicemail began to load. And for the first time, the executive didn't speak at all. The voicemail began before anyone in the room could stop it. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a small, distorted breath of audio leaking through cheap phone speakers, filling the silence like a stain spreading under glass. A man's voice, calm, procedural, spoke first. Subject entered at 6:15 under override authorization. Bracelet sync confirmed. Continue monitoring until relocation is complete. The line cut off halfway through a second sentence, replaced by static that sounded too intentional to be accidental. The waitress didn't move. Her thumb stayed pressed against the edge of the phone like she was afraid letting go would erase the only thing that had ever been honest tonight. Outside the private suite, rain tapped softly against tall glass windows, steady and indifferent, while inside the air tightened in a way no one wanted to acknowledge. The handler exhaled through his nose, a controlled sound meant to reset the room. Audio corruption, he said gently. That file is incomplete and therefore inadmissible as system evidence. The executive nodded immediately, too quickly, as if agreeing was safer than thinking. We can escalate this to compliance review in the morning. There is no need for disruption now. The waitress finally spoke, her voice steady but lower than before. It's not incomplete. It stops when the second voice starts. She didn't explain further. She didn't need to. The absence inside the file said more than the words ever did. The mafia boss didn't look at her when he responded. He was still watching the phone, but his attention had shifted inward, like something behind his eyes had begun reorganizing itself into a new pattern. Send me the raw source file, he said to one of his men.
No urgency.
Just instruction. The man left immediately. No questions.
No hesitation.
That was when the room changed again, subtly, because action had replaced discussion. The handler noticed it first. Not the request, but the absence of resistance to it. A server's tablet buzzed on the counter. Then stopped. Then buzzed again. The executive turned it face down without looking at it. Too late. The mafia boss had already seen the notification glow. Security node access. Request approved pending. The waitress lowered her gaze for a second. Not in submission, but in thought. I don't want compensation, she said suddenly, almost quietly enough to be mistaken for nothing. The executive looked at her like she had misread the language of the room. Excuse me? I don't want money, she repeated. Her fingers tightened around the phone. I want the log to stop changing after I speak. That sentence didn't belong in the system they were all standing inside. The handler smiled again, but it no longer had structure. No one is changing logs. You are experiencing correlation bias due to stress. She didn't respond to him. Instead, she placed the phone gently on the marble counter, not letting go completely until she was sure it wouldn't slide. My mother's hospital records were attached to this system, she said. So don't tell me it's just stress. That was the first time the executive looked away. Not fully. Just enough to avoid direct contact. The mafia boss finally moved. Not toward her, not toward the handler, but toward the wall terminal near the service entrance. He tapped once, then again. A second later, a secure interface opened without sound. Pull every access log tied to her bracelet ID, he said. From the moment of issuance. A pause. Cross-reference with internal compliance overrides. The room did not react outwardly, but the temperature of it changed. Not physically, structurally. The waitress watched him now, not with hope, but with something closer to containment. Like she was holding herself back from believing too quickly. Outside, a distant sound of a dishwasher starting in the lower kitchen echoed upward through vents, ordinary and steady, grounding everything in something real. The handler finally stepped closer, softer now. You are opening a chain of records that was never meant to be linear, he said. You understand that, don't you? The mafia boss didn't answer immediately. When he did, it was barely more than a breath of sound. That's exactly why I'm opening it. A notification appeared on the terminal. Then another. Then a third. The first line of reconstructed access data loaded across the screen, and the mafia boss stopped reading halfway through it. Not because he didn't understand it. Because he did. His gaze shifted slightly toward the executive for the first time in a way that no longer carried neutrality. It carried recognition of error. And in that small, quiet pause, he realized he had been trusting the wrong silence for a very long time. The mafia boss didn't move after the last line of data appeared on the terminal. He didn't need to. The room had already shifted around him, like gravity had quietly chosen a new center. On the screen, fragmented access logs continued to rebuild themselves, line by line, correcting what someone had tried to erase. Each correction felt less like data and more like testimony. The handler stood perfectly still now, hands relaxed at his sides, but his breathing had changed, just enough to notice if someone was already watching him too closely. The waitress remained near the marble counter, but she was no longer folding into herself. She was listening, not to people, to inconsistencies. The 632 gap is not missing, the mafia boss said quietly, eyes still on the terminal. It was overwritten twice. No one responded. That was no longer surprising. He turned slightly toward the executive. Show me who authorized the second overwrite. The executive didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached for her phone with slow precision, as if movement itself had to be approved internally before execution. Authorization came from Compliance Escalation Protocol, she said carefully. Level 3 clearance. The waitress's hand tightened once on the edge of the counter. Not fear. Recognition. That's not what the phone voice said, she said. Everyone turned slightly, not fully, just enough to register that she had interrupted structure again. The handler smiled gently, but it was now the kind of smile used when explaining a mistake to someone who wasn't supposed to understand systems. Audio artifacts are unreliable under network stress, he said. You are correlating unrelated inputs. The mafia boss finally stepped away from the terminal. Not toward her. Not toward the handler. Toward the room itself, as if inspecting the space that had been built around them. Call the corridor camera again, he said to his man. Live feed. Not backup. A pause. Then softer. And bring up access wrist scans for every staff member in this suite. That was the moment the executive's expression changed, subtle, but irreversible. Not panic. Calculation. The waitress noticed it first. She always noticed the smallest fractures. The way people stopped correcting themselves when they knew correction wouldn't help anymore. From the service entrance, a staff member entered with a tablet, then stopped immediately upon seeing the room's silence. The feed is stable, he said too quickly. There is no anomaly in the corridor system. The mafia boss looked at him. Show it. The tablet turned toward the center of the room. A paused frame appeared. Corridor footage from 632. Empty hallway. Clean. Controlled. Perfect. Too perfect. The waitress took one step forward without realizing it. That's not the hallway I walked, she said. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. There was a service cart near the east wall. It's not there. The staff member hesitated. Just a fraction. But enough. The mafia boss noticed it immediately. Zoom left edge, he said. The image adjusted. For half a second, something flickered at the edge of the frame, reflection distortion or movement or something that shouldn't have been caught but was. Then it stabilized again into emptiness. The handler stepped forward slightly, tone unchanged. You are interpreting compression error as physical presence. The waitress didn't look at him. She looked at the timestamp. The clock in the kitchen was 2 minutes fast, she said suddenly. No one reacted at first. Then she continued. I saw it when I came through service. It showed 6:14 when my phone showed 6:12. A silence dropped again, but this time it had weight. The mafia boss turned his head slightly toward her. You didn't mention that earlier. Because I thought it was normal, she said. Until I saw the logs don't match anything that was supposed to be normal. The executive finally spoke again, softer now. Kitchen clocks are manually adjusted for service flow. It is irrelevant to security mapping. But the mafia boss didn't look at her anymore. He was already connecting the inconsistency. It's not irrelevant, he said. It's synchronization. He turned back to the terminal. Every system here is aligned to a manipulated time base. The handler's smile disappeared for the first time completely. Not fear. Recognition. The waitress felt it before anyone said it. The system wasn't broken. It was arranged. The staff member holding the tablet shifted his grip slightly, as if suddenly aware of how visible he had become. The mafia boss stepped closer to him. Who controls timestamp authority for this facility? He asked. The staff member hesitated. Compliance oversight. Name, the mafia boss said. Not louder, just final. The staff member's mouth opened, then closed again. That was enough. The waitress watched him struggle, not physically, but structurally, like someone realizing every answer they had been trained to give no longer fit the question being asked. Behind him, the corridor camera feed flickered again for a fraction of a second, this time not empty, but overwritten by a still image of the waitress standing in a place she had never stood at 6:32. The handler saw it too. His hand tightened once at his side. The executive finally turned her head away, and in that exact moment the mafia boss didn't speak. He simply looked at the handler, and for the first time the handler understood that the waitress was no longer the only person being examined. The corridor feed froze for exactly 1 second longer than it should have. Not a glitch, an interruption. Then it resumed, but something had changed in how the room felt watching it. The mafia boss stood motionless in front of the tablet, eyes locked on the overwritten frame like it had just confessed without permission. The handler didn't move. The executive didn't speak. Even the staff member holding the device seemed to understand, on a level below language, that silence had become dangerous. The waitress stepped forward for the first time without being prompted. Not fast. Not dramatic. Just enough to claim space the system had tried to deny her. Play the original backup, she said. Her voice was steady, but it carried something sharper now. Not confidence, but refusal. The staff member hesitated, glancing instinctively toward the handler. That hesitation was the mistake. The mafia boss noticed it immediately. Do it, he said. Not louder, just final. The backup file opened. For a moment, nothing appeared except static and timestamp metadata. Then the corridor came back, real this time. At 6:32 p.m., the waitress stood near the east service wall, exactly where she said she was. But she was not alone. A second figure stood beside her in the frame, partially cropped, partially blurred, but unmistakably present. The handler shifted slightly. The executive's hand tightened around her phone. The waitress didn't react emotionally. She leaned in instead, pointing once at the lower corner of the footage. Pause there, she said. The staff member obeyed. The frame froze. On the screen, the second figure reached toward the waitress's wrist. Not guiding, not adjusting, locking. The bracelet glowed faintly in response. The mafia boss didn't move, but something inside his expression changed. Something that didn't belong to authority anymore. It belonged to recognition. The staff member tried to speak. That's not. Zoom the hand, the waitress said, cutting him off. The image enlarged. The bracelet's serial pattern aligned perfectly with a registry tag embedded in the system overlay. The handler finally spoke, voice still controlled but thinner now. That clip is not authenticated. It has been externally interpolated. The waitress didn't look at him. It has your timestamp signature, she said. The room tightened. The executive stepped forward slightly. You are misreading metadata injection artifacts. Stop, the mafia boss said. One word. No force. No volume. The executive stopped. Not because she wanted to, because something in that word removed the option to continue. The mafia boss walked closer to the screen. He stared at the bracelet being locked in the footage. Not the waitress. The system. Then he did something no one expected. He reached out and pulled up the audit layer beneath the video. Not the visible layer. The raw compliance index. Lines of authorization cascaded down the screen, too fast for most to read, but not for him. His eyes stopped on one line, then stayed there too long. The waitress saw it too. She didn't know all the language, but she knew numbers. She knew patterns. And she saw her wrist ID linked directly to an authorization node signed not by the handler, but by the executive. The silence that followed wasn't shock. It was structural collapse. The executive tried to speak, but nothing came out immediately. The handler finally stepped forward, voice soft again, almost pleading now. You are looking at a misassigned delegation chain. This does not represent intent. The mafia boss didn't turn toward him. He was still looking at the screen, at the signature, at the confirmation that the system had not been broken, but directed. Slowly, he leaned back from the tablet. Just slightly, like distance was suddenly required to think clearly. The waitress exhaled once, small and controlled, and for the first time she didn't look at the system anymore. She looked at the people who had built it. The mafia boss finally spoke, but not to her, not to the room, to the realization settling behind his eyes. I approved this structure, he said quietly. No one responded. Not because they disagreed, but because it was the first truth in the room that no one could redirect. He took a step back from the screen, then another. His gaze shifted once toward the executive. No anger yet, only distance forming where trust had been. And when he finally spoke again, it wasn't loud enough to echo. It didn't need to be. Bring me the original contract ledger, he said. Every version. The executive didn't move. The handler didn't breathe. And for the first time since the beginning of the night, the waitress understood she was no longer the anomaly in the system. She was the witness to its failure. The original contract ledger arrived without ceremony. No announcement, no explanation. Just a black leather folder placed on the marble table like a body being returned to evidence. The executive didn't reach for it. The handler didn't either. The mafia boss opened it himself. Slowly, one page at a time. No rush in his movements, only certainty growing heavier with each sheet. The waitress stood a few steps behind him, hands relaxed at her sides now, no longer holding anything except attention she had never been allowed to have before. The silence in the room wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting for judgment. Page after page confirmed what the footage had already suggested. Duplicated signatures, overwritten authorization chains, identity override clauses disguised as compliance language. But the final page was different. It was not altered. It was original. And it listed her name, incorrectly spelled, deliberately misfiled, assigned to a classification that reduced her from person to monitored asset under the executive's authorization line. The mafia boss stopped there, not moving, not blinking at first. Then his thumb slowly pressed the edge of the paper like he needed to confirm it was physical, not imagined. The executive finally spoke, her voice steady but stripped of its earlier confidence. That classification was standard protocol for transitional placements. It was never intended as harm. The waitress stepped forward one step. Only one. Not toward power. Toward truth. My mother's hospital invoices were attached to that classification, she said quietly. That's not protocol. That's leverage. No one corrected her. That silence mattered more than agreement. The handler tried to recover the structure of the room. You are misinterpreting systemic safeguards as coercion? Stop talking, the mafia boss said. Not loud. Not emotional. Final. The handler obeyed without realizing he had chosen to. The mafia boss turned. The ledger slightly toward the executive. Explain this signature overlap. The executive didn't answer immediately. That delay was enough. He saw it. You didn't approve all of it, he said softly, almost to himself. Then his eyes lifted. You approved enough. The executive's composure fractured just enough to be visible now. It was risk mitigation. For who? He asked. The question didn't escalate. It narrowed. That was worse. The waitress didn't speak again, but she didn't need to. She reached into her pocket and placed something on the table beside the ledger. The old phone. The same one from before. The screen still cracked, still worn, still alive. One notification remained open. A single audio file. The mafia boss didn't touch it. He didn't have to. The timestamp alone was enough. 6:32 p.m., repeated across 3 systems with 3 different labels. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he did something quieter than anger. He closed the ledger. Slowly, carefully, like finalizing a verdict he had not wanted to understand. This system didn't fail, he said. It was designed to exclude her. The executive didn't respond this time. Not even defensively, because there was nothing left that would hold. The handler finally stepped back half a step, as if distance could restore safety. Didn't. The mafia boss turned slightly toward the waitress. For the first time all night, his voice softened. Not in weakness, but in recognition. What do you want corrected? She didn't answer immediately. Not because she didn't know, because no one had ever asked her in a room like this before. When she finally spoke, it wasn't about money. It wasn't about punishment. My name, she said. On everything. A pause. And my mother's records. Unlinked from this system. The mafia boss nodded once, then turned toward his legal team standing quietly at the edge of the room. Do it, he said.
No debate. No clarification.
Just instruction. The executive was escorted away without resistance. The handler followed seconds later, already removed from decision space before he could argue.
No spectacle.
Just removal of authority. The room emptied of distortion before it emptied of people. Minutes later, softer light replaced the harsh overhead glare. The waitress stood near the marble counter where everything had begun, except now the space felt different, no longer procedural but real. A staff member returned with a reprinted card. Not labeled asset, not placeholder. Her name, correctly spelled, embossed cleanly on white plastic. She took it carefully as if weight could still be taken back. The mafia boss watched her for a moment, then placed something beside the card. The bracelet, broken now, inactive, stripped of its function, not thrown away, returned. It doesn't track anything anymore, he said. It's just metal. She looked at it for a long time. Then, instead of putting it on, she placed it inside her apron pocket. Cleaned, folded, quiet. Outside the glass, the rain had stopped. Inside, a small staff kitchen light had been turned on somewhere behind the corridor. Soft yellow spilling into the hallway like something ordinary refusing to be erased. She walked past it, apron still on, no longer tightening at her wrist. A coffee was already waiting on a counter she hadn't noticed before. Hot, simple, untouched. She sat down for the first time that night without being positioned. The mafia boss didn't join her immediately. He stayed standing for a moment longer, watching her not as a case, not as a system failure, but as someone who had survived being made invisible. Then he sat at a distance that respected silence instead of filling it. She took a sip of coffee. Slow, steady. Not because she needed it, but because she could. And for the first time, when she spoke again, it wasn't to prove anything. It's quiet now, she said. He nodded once. It should have been. The room stayed like that, no longer powerful, no longer hiding anything. Just still enough for truth to remain where it had finally landed.